Okay, in this video we're going to be taking a look at Thomas Hobbes' justification for government. So this is an issue that comes up within political theory. The basic question is, how do we justify the coercive power of the state or government to restrict our freedoms? So this is an important issue because it's not obvious why a governing body or an institution can restrict our freedom. There has to be a good reason for this. So what is the justification for government and the restrictions on our freedom that come about through law and policy that the government issues? What Thomas Hobbes does is he starts with a kind of thought experiment. He says, well, if we're going to try to justify the government and the power of the government to restrict our freedoms, let's think of a situation in which there is no government and then see whether or not it would be rational to endorse setting up a government. Hobbes calls this the state of nature. In the state of nature, there is no government, there's no morality, there are no rules. He starts by characterizing the state of nature, and then he's going to show why, given this characterization, it would be rational to choose for there to be a government. So how does he characterize the state of nature? The first thing to know is that in the state of nature, according to Hobbes, we have what he calls the right of nature, which is a right of absolute freedom. We have the right to anything that we need or want in order to survive and thrive. And what this means is that in the state of nature, there's no rules or laws. We have an absolute right to freedom. So what follows from this? What are the consequences of this in the state of nature? Well, the first thing to know is that for Hobbes, in the state of nature, all human beings, all people have more or less equal capacity and strength and intelligence. The second thing to note is that there is a scarcity of resources within the state of nature. Now, let's take a look at that first point. In the state of nature, everyone is more or less equal in strength and intelligence. This is important because if it was some other kind of case, then we might want to endorse or set up a government or some system of authority in a different way and for different reasons than if it were the case that we are all more or less equal in strength and intelligence. Consider, for example, in the state of nature there are humans and then there are super mutants like X-Men that are drastically more powerful or intelligent than human beings. In a case like this, it may be rational for human beings to simply submit to the power of the mutants and just let them, take control of society because there's no other good option. And so if that were the case, then we would have a different grounding of authority on the part of a governing body. But it's just so happens it's not the case. All we have are humans, and we have more or less an equal ability in getting what we want. Given that, and given the scarcity of resource, what you get is conflict. People are going to be in conflict trying to get what they need in order to survive and thrive. Now, there are also some other causes of this conflict. Another cause is distrust. So one thing that Hobbes is saying here is that it's part of human nature not to trust other people, especially in the state of nature. So if you're in the state of nature, you're not going to trust that your neighbor is going to abide by an agreement not to, say, steal your cattle or not to kill you in your sleep and steal your things. So you can't trust other people. The second thing that leads to conflict in the state of nature is a desire for what Hobbes calls glory. In the state of nature, we're going to want what he calls glory because we want to establish a reputation for strength. So if we have this glory, then people are not going to come and steal your stuff or harm you. So all these things, an equal ability in getting the things we need, a more or less equal ability, scarcity of resources, a distrust, a general distrust of other people, and this desire for glory, all those things lead to conflict within the state of nature, and it leads to the state of nature being a state of war. So this leads to Hobbes saying his famous quote, which is that the state of nature In the state of nature, life is short, nasty, brutish, and basically a hellish place. Okay, so that's important for Hobbes. The state of nature is going to be a hellish place, and basically it's because we have this freedom, this absolute freedom to do what we want, and it's going to lead to all this conflict. So we can sort of work out his argument in this way. The first premise, we could say, in the state of nature, everyone has a right to anything they need to survive or thrive, and that's what he calls the right of nature. Second premise, exercising this right causes the state of nature to be a state of war. Third premise, it's irrational to want to be in a state of war, so it's rational to want to leave a state of war. This should be pretty obvious. Now, because the only way to leave the state of war is to set up a government, then it would be rational, it follows that it's rational to endorse there being a government. Okay, so why would it be rational in the state of nature to set up a government? And what he means here by a government is an institution who has the power and authority to enforce contracts, to enforce agreements. Well, here's why it's rational to want there to be a government. Imagine you're in the state of nature and you have some neighbors and you try to come to an agreement not to overhunt the forest, because if each neighbor hunts as much as they can to get as much food as they can, then that's going to deplete the forest of its natural resources. It'll deplete the forest of all the deer, let's say. So you make an agreement. Now, can you trust that others are going to abide by that agreement? According to Hobbes, no. But not only that, it may be rational on the part of each individual to break that agreement. Because if everybody else is agreeing to restrain their hunting, then you're going to say, well, if I don't restrain my hunting and try to get as many deer as I can, I'm going to benefit and come out on top. And the forest is not going to be depleted of deer because everyone else is going to be restraining their hunting. But here's the problem. If that's rational for you, for one individual, then it's going to be rational for everyone else. And then everyone else is going to do it, and it's going to deplete the forest of deer, and everybody's going to starve to death. That's known as the tragedy of the commons. So what we need is we need a governing body with the authority and the power to enforce those agreements, to enforce those contracts. Because if there's not a body to enforce them, people will break them because it's going to be in their interest to break them. And if people keep breaking these agreements, then you're going to have a state of conflict, you're going to have a state of war, and it's just not rational to want to live in a state of war, to live in that kind of conflict. So that's why for Hobbes it's rational to endorse the existence of a government. So again, just to quickly recap, Hobbes starts, well, the basic question is, how do we justify the coercive power of government? How do we justify a government? And Hobbes starts by asking, well, let's imagine a situation where there is no government. That kind of situation is going to be very bad. It's going to be a state of war for the reasons that we gave. Therefore, it's rational to want to get out of that state of war. And if the only way to do that is to set up a government, then it's rational to set up a government. So that's Hobbes' justification for government in a nutshell.